Tribe is an Island, Placemaking, Protest, and the Alcatraz occupation. And I'll just go ahead and introduce you all, and that way you can just move through your talks. Ava Polzin finished her undergraduate study at Northwestern in 2018 in physics and astronomy and earth and planetary sciences, and will begin her PhD at Yale in the fall. Congratulations. She had the great fortune of meeting Patty Lowe just in time to help plan and implement 2 STEM outreach weekends, one for a group of Ojibwe girls and one for some Lakota friends, that she organized while wrapping up her own research at Northwestern. And her talk is titled Stellar STEM Weekends. Ava Prcela is a student at Northwestern University studying journalism, English literature, and civic engagement. And the title of her talk is Traditional Ecological Knowledge in the Apostle Islands. So please join me in welcoming our undergraduate fellows.
Hi everybody. I'm so happy to be here today. I'm very excited to share my research with you all. I just want to start out by thanking CNAIR for putting together this conference. I guess CNAIR, it's like the GIF debate. I say CNAIR, I say GIF. But yes, it's been such, the Native community in general on campus has been such an important part of my time at Northwestern. And CNAIR has been, and working people affiliated with CNAIR have been such an important part of my growth as a researcher, but also just a community. I'm happy to be a part of every day, happy to see so many people I care about and have loved getting to know these past couple of years in the room today. So today I am going to share my research based on a paper that I wrote in the fall. In the fall, I studied abroad in Paris as part of the Art, Literature, and Contemporary European Thought program. I'd like to thank Michael Lorio, my professor, one of my professors from this program, for being here today. And in this program, we learned about art and philosophy, and critical theory, and literature, and just bringing together a lot of ideas from the humanities. And I had an incredible time. And I learned a lot, and I read a lot, and it concluded with a 30-page paper about the Alcatraz occupation. What I did and what I'll talk about today is engage with these ideas from critical theory about the relationship between art and politics. And I saw a lot of merit in them, and I saw a lot of connections to the relational worldviews that I hold as an Indigenous person, and wanted to bring that out in my paper. So the title of the talk, the title of my paper, which will be published this fall in the Columbia Journal of Politics and Society, is A Tribe is an Island, Placemaking, Protest, and the Alcatraz Occupation. So I'll start by giving an introduction to Alcatraz and a bit of the history. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. And then I'll give an overview of some of the theories that I'm working with, both in relation to decolonization and also to art and politics. And then do a close reading of a photograph of the occupation that kind of will show how my methodology plays out. So for 19 months, beginning in November 1969, a group of Indigenous activists and allies calling themselves Indians of all tribes occupied Alcatraz Island. The IAT occupation, which made international headlines and brought unprecedented public attention to the American Indian Civil Rights Movement, mobilized Indigenous communities across the U.S., strengthened intertribal partnerships, and laid a foundation for American Indian protest movements in the second half of the 20th century. Mohawk writer and activist Peter Blue Cloud's poem, Alcatraz Visions, published in an IAT newsletter, sets the scene of the occupation and expresses a similar optimism. The poem's final stanza speaks to the protest's radical approach to the land. I'll share an excerpt from the poem. Steel bridges all across this bay, connecting land and bumper to bumper pane. Dreams on Alcatraz are of a different bridge, fashioned of sunlight and soft voices. Here, Blue Cloud is setting up a poetic contrast between the settler modernity of San Francisco, epitomized by the images of steel bridges and dense traffic, in the sovereign indigenous space that IAT created on Alcatraz, represented by an image of sunlight and soft voices. Settler presence on indigenous land is painful, he acknowledges, but the occupation represents a bridge toward solidarity, resistance, and decolonization. And my paper and my project takes a closer look at this bridge of sunlight and soft voices, and at the radically indigenous sense of place created by Alcatraz occupiers between 1969 and 1971. So in my paper, I argue that through their visible acts of protest and placemaking, the occupiers changed the cartography of the perceptible, the thinkable, and the feasible in ways that continue to inform indigenous art and protest today. So I'll give a brief overview of the occupation. In the early hours of November 20th, 1969, 89 Native people of varied ages and tribes made their way to Alcatraz with the goal of laying groundwork for a Native university, museum, and community center. Calling themselves Indians of all tribes, the group issued a proclamation claiming the surplus federal property by right of discovery and offering to buy it from the U.S. government for $24 in glass beads and red cloth, to quote, a precedent set by the white man's purchase of a similar island about 300 years ago. And word of the occupation spread, thousands of people came to visit the island, send supplies, and support it, and this really vibrant, fluctuating, but vibrant community developed on the island. And I wanted to share kind of a sense of what a lot of these spaces looked like. Reminders of indigenous presence surrounded the occupiers as they lived, worked, and danced on Alcatraz. Spray-painted letters, as you see here, along the walk to the main cell house read, "You are on Indian land," the Indian underlined for emphasis. So even though officers removed the occupiers from the island on June 11, 1971, the occupation brought, like I said earlier, so much attention to the situation of indigenous peoples in the U.S. and sparked a lot of similar demonstrations that drew on its symbolic power and on this tactic of occupation. Throughout their 19 months on Alcatraz, occupiers employed visual strategies to recuperate the island as a decolonized place where they could reclaim and practice indigenous lifeways. And drawing on ideas from critical theory that I encountered in my study abroad program, and building on them and looking at them through the lens of indigenous theorists like Eve Tuck and Kay Yang, I argue that IAT's acts of placemaking open possibilities for decolonial political construction and community building on Alcatraz and beyond. So I'm going to give an overview of some of the theory that I'm using in my project. I'm sure many of you are aware of the essay, "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor." I first read this essay in a class with Kelly freshman year, and it's really informed a lot of my thinking, both in my writing and in my day-to-day life and life as a member of this community. So in Tuck and Yang's essay, they lay out a framework for understanding both the mechanisms of settler colonialism and the radical and necessarily tangible nature of decolonization. Settler colonialism, they explain, is different from other forms of colonialism that settlers come with the intention of making a new home on the land, a homemaking that insists on settler sovereignty over all things in their new domain. In order to maintain sovereignty, settlers must completely possess the land they occupy, and in order to possess the land, they must transform it into a source of capital. So they argue that the drive towards possession precludes any relationships to land that do not conform to capitalistic modes of ownership. And the epistemological, cosmological, and above all, personal relationships of indigenous communities to the land must be erased under settler colonialism. And thus it follows that any decolonization must bring about the repatriation of indigenous land and life. So colonization is decolonization is a concrete rather than abstract process that requires this tangible recuperation. And through the lens of Tuck and Yang's frameworks, the Alcatraz occupation represents a decolonial act that simultaneously reclaimed land from the settler colonial state, as the proclamation expresses, and recuperated indigenous ways of life rooted in connection to the land. So in order to achieve this land, occupiers focus their visual and political strategies on the intersection of land and affect, in other words, on place. And due to time, I also draw on an essay by Robert Runstrom called American Indian Placemaking on Alcatraz, 1969-1971, where Runstrom argues that practices of placemaking on Alcatraz also created the sense of community. So I'm not going to go into this right now for sake of time, but I highly recommend that you all check out this essay. So the major theoretical concept that I'm drawing on, aside from Chuck and Yang's idea of decolonization, is this idea of the aesthetic break set forth by a French theorist, Jacques Rancière, in his book, The Emancipated Spectator, which was published in 2011. And in this book, Rancière is thinking a lot about the relationship between politics and art, and with questions of spectatorship in modern and contemporary art. And this idea of the aesthetic break can be best described as the separation between an author's intentions in creating a work of art and a reader's response to encountering it. So, in other words, it represents the breakdown, to quote Rancière, of a regime of concordance between sense and sense that he links to classical theater. So you see a play, it's instructive, it tells you to do something, and there's a connection here. But Rancière is making the argument that in contemporary art, and in general in modernity, there is a breakdown there. So there's no knowing exactly how something will be received or what will come out of that. And although that creates a lot of uncertainty and can frustrate artistic attempts at political mobilization, Rancière argues that the aesthetic break opens up radical possibilities for art, and through this uncertainty, there's possibility created. And that's what I'm arguing in terms of Alcatraz. And he gives a couple of examples of the aesthetic break. One in terms of social relations, and also in terms of the rupture between a work of art's mise en scène and its original destination. So where we encounter a work of art and how, in the physical environment of it. So another important idea from Rancière that I'm drawing on is the argument that the realm of art and the realm of everyday life are one and the same. So in order to, again for sake of time, I'm going to move on to a reading of an image from Alcatraz that draws on these ideas, right here. So this image, so my project focuses on the visual culture of Alcatraz, such as graffiti on the island and the photography that came from it. So these modes, these visible modes of protest signified indigenous presence on and connection to the island through engaging the aesthetic break. This photograph of occupiers playing ball games, taken on November 26, 1969, is a really helpful and engaging example of that. In this image, 4 Native people stand on a concrete lot in front of former prison offices. One clutches a football, 2 look on with interest, and 1, mid-jump and hands outstretched, tosses a basketball into the air. Behind and above them, in the center of the photograph's frame, rests a graffiti sign whose jubilant and defiant tone reflects the playful scene. The sign originally marked Alcatraz as United States property, forbidding non-government boats and declaring that no one was allowed ashore without a pass. Protesters crossed out states and added text to claim the island as United Indian property, a visual act underscoring the occupation's pan-Indian politics, and, by declaring Alcatraz Indian property, its goal of land repatriation. They removed no one from the final sentence, resulting in a disembodied phrase, allowed ashore without a pass, that spoke to the movement's inclusivity. These humorous plays on the text of the sign both critiqued government politics and contributed to a sense of community on the island. However, as Chuck and Yang's theories suggest, decolonization requires not only struggle against colonial structures, such as those represented by the original sign, but the resurgence of Indigenous language and humanity. Occupiers materialize this language and humanity by painting figures outside the physical and semantic boundaries of the sign. Indians welcome an Indian land, the latter accompanied by a drawing of a bird of prey. Like the arms of the basketball-playing occupier, the bird's arms stretch toward the sky in upward motion to stake out Indigenous presence on the island. IAT's repurposing of the sign and its surroundings reflects the aesthetic break between authorial attention and audience reception. The sign quite literally circumscribed audience behavior by forbidding anyone without a pass to enter Alcatraz. But, as Frantz Fanon writes in The Wretched of the Earth, it is a known fact that under certain emotional circumstances of colonization, an obstacle actually escalates action. And as Rancière shows in The Emancipated Spectator and through his notion of the aesthetic break, the direct line between performance, response, and behavior can be broken in service of protest. By infusing the sign's language with decolonial sentiment, an effective disposition that the federal government certainly did not intend it to inspire, the occupiers made themselves and their political goals legible. And in the paper, and I hope to expand this project into a thesis next year, and I look forward to working with Kelly further on this project. I would like to look at the link between protests such as these, continue looking at these ideas of the aesthetic break, of decolonization, and look toward Indigenous protests today. And thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A.
Hi all, I am Ava Polzin. As you may have gathered, my area of research is in physics, so I will not be as verbose as if I were talking about that. However, this entire project is actually about facilitating other people's research. So this was an effort that really came about in what could only be described as a circuitous and synchronistic manner. And I will get into a little bit of the background before I start, but the main purpose of this talk is to really go through what this Stellar STEM weekend might look like using the template of our most recent one, which we ran a month and a half ago at the end of March. And I do hope that somebody in this audience might be interested in picking up the mantle, as I will personally be leaving, and it would be wonderful if this could continue, because there is a lot of department interest within physics and astronomy. So a little bit of the background on this. All of this started about 10 years ago when I met a young man afraid of his horse and realized just how fortunate I was to be a girl growing up in the suburbs of Chicago with all of the enrichment opportunities that I had available to me. What originally was an effort to bring 1 or 2 girls a year to do a self-defense camp in Chicago at Thousand Waves Martial Arts ended up transitioning to music in the interest of getting an older girl to come to a shorter camp. And we partnered with Girls Rock Chicago for a number of years. When eventually Girls Rock Pine Ridge was set up on the reservation, we transitioned to permanent music programs that would actually be available to students in the schools. And so with the help of a benefactor, we were able to set up 2 music programs. Thought that was the end of my involvement. But when I got to Northwestern and I took a job at Dearborn Observatory, one of my friends from Pine Ridge saw my pictures and noted that this was a dream of hers, to see something through our telescope. It happened that there was a little bit of kismet within the department, and as fields go, physics is not incredibly diverse. About 20% female, to say the least. And certainly one of the most lacking groups is underrepresented minorities. We just don't have any. And one of my good friends in physics was very interested in trying to engage with native populations to kind of bring into the fold people who generally would have felt excluded from a field that is predominantly male and predominantly white. Unfortunately, she left for a postdoctoral position before she ever got to see this come to fruition, but after seeking out Jasmine Gourneau, I was fortuitously connected with Professor Patty Lowe and given the opportunity to run these programs twice in 1 year, in fact. So with the support of the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion and CNAIR, I'm also a GIF person, this was made possible. And so I just want to go into a little bit of the weekend setup. There are a couple of changes as we moved into this weekend for Lakota Girls versus our Bad River Ojibwe guests from the fall. But I'm going with the most recent since it's being optimized as this continues to move forward. So to kind of walk you folks through the weekend, I just want to start with our objectives. So the idea here is to give students exposure to STEM at a young age. I know I would have been grateful for the opportunity, and I came from an affluent school and a privileged situation, excuse me. But this is a really great opportunity for students to connect with professors, make contacts that they can continue to reach out to as they go about their early career, and see a little bit about what college might be kind of like. So ideally, everyone when they leave is given a contact sheet, and if hopefully somebody is interested, they might reach out to one of these professors in the future for research, and hopefully we'll get 1 or 2 new astrophysicists out of this at the end of their career. So one of the big things though, and this is where this is really going, is the establishment of a bridge between physics and astronomy, or other sciences if somebody is so interested, and our group here, CNAIR, or CNAIR, and really giving people the opportunity to self-direct their knowledge from their own cultural experience. And that will be further addressed by one of the talks that I'm going to describe that was given. But we started with, as you might expect, a little welcome and campus tour. The Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion kindly donated notebooks and little welcome gifts so that the girls all felt welcome. And because there are no pictures of the tour, this is all we have for that. So that's Friday evening. They come in on Friday, they get this, get a little bit of food going, some snacks, and then they go to a magic physics show with Professor Archman. Now, these are middle school girls. So as you can imagine, between the ages of 12 and 15, they're probably a little less interested in physics than they are in seeing a magic show. This is kind of the perfect middle ground. So these are various optical tricks, things to do with kinematics, superconductivity, all of that sort of thing, which give the girls a sense of all of the possibilities of the field. And then, as you can see, they make liquid nitrogen ice cream, because who doesn't want ice cream? Then on Saturday morning, they get up early, and this is the part that's really important, because this is where we're facilitating the research. And they received citizen science training with zooniverse.org, if anyone's interested. Some people have actually explored the humanities projects that are already available on there. But they've got some great astronomy ones. And Cherie Peters, who is herself an Indigenous woman at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, she's getting her PhD this year, and Professor Christopher Berry offered girls a little tutorial on how to use the Zooniverse and how to engage with research that they could take home. All you need is a computer and an internet connection. As you can see, this was engaging for both the chaperones that attended and the girls. And really, if this were to be implemented again, the first time we implemented it, it was an hour. This time it was 3 hours. You can make this a whole day. And I actually think it would be important too, because I don't know that everyone gets enough sense of what's possible with this within a 3-hour period even. So citizen science is often targeted in middle school classrooms. There are a lot of projects that are set up for middle schoolers to do by the Zooniverse. It's run out of the Adler Planetarium in conjunction with Cambridge. And this gives girls a great chance to get something tangible out of their experience. So there are various ways of involvement, and ideally they're going to go to ACES in the fall. It's not looking so likely right now just because the school year is ending and they haven't had the opportunity to do as much as they might want with it. But in the future, if they had, say, a whole day, that might be very possible and a nice outcome. After that exciting bit of research, they get to go into Chicago, which of course is everybody's favorite part, because many of these girls have never left the reservation, have never left their hometown. And getting to see Chicago is itself awe-inspiring for them, but Adler Planetarium is a great way for them to see what's called the Space Visualization Lab. So my personal research advisor, Erin Geller, who you can see in the bottom picture there with the girls, is part of the Space Visualization Lab. They do all of the fun kind of stuff that you might see, gravitational waves colliding, all of the visuals you see associated with this. And that is another way to kind of engage middle schoolers in something that's a little bit less, boring and tedious and sciencey. So after that, the centerpiece of the entire weekend, the cultural exchange dinner. Now, to capture the scope of this, I did include pictures from our weekend with the Ojibwe girls in September, co-facilitated by Professor Hattie Lowe and Wen-Fei Hong in the fall, and Pam Silas, and in theory Dr. Deborah Brown. In the spring, this was an opportunity to have parity between two faculty members sharing native star knowledge, and then also kind of the science behind the stories or adjacent science, which gives the girls a good way to integrate their cultural understanding as well as their scientific one. So in both cases, the girls were able to share a little bit of their knowledge. Unfortunately, these are middle schoolers and they are self-conscious, so there may be a better way to implement this moving forward so that they feel a little bit less insecure. But this was the opportunity to give something back to the university as well, because many of the physics and astronomy faculty that were engaged in this, who attended both of the evenings, were very excited to learn about the girls' culture and have the girls share that, kind of take ownership of that and share it with people they might be a little intimidated by. These are faculty members after all. So after this, which is of course very exciting for all of them, they gorge themselves on food, we have a sleepover, Dearborn Observatory, which is a very unusual circumstance. You do have to have people stay up all night with them. And in both cases, we got post-baccalaureate students and graduate students to do this. You can also see pictures from our Ojibwe weekend there, just because 14 and 15-year-olds are less likely to get chummy with graduate students. But the goal of this was to have the dome open all night, give them the opportunity to see the changing views, and in fact, in the spring we were able to see both Jupiter and Saturn. Had some very tired girls because those came up at 3 and 4 a.m. respectively. But it's a nice opportunity to use our historic telescope for something other than just our weekly Friday night viewing. Sunday, of course, centers on talks. Gotta have some research talks in there. Professor Raphael Margutti talked about stellar death. Professor Zosha Kruzberg talked about meditation and meaningful ways of approaching contemplative learning. And Professor Megan Bang actually talked about integrating cultural knowledge with scientific knowledge. And so these were a good opportunity for the girls to have a more classroom-like approach to the college experience, and to engage with faculty members that they could speak to about their own aspirations, their own interests, and their career paths. So I'm just going to leave my contact info up here in case anyone has any questions or would like to implement this in the future. I am more than happy to speak to anyone even about implementing a similar program. And thank you all for coming and listening, and really, again, thank you to CNAIR and the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion for facilitating this effort.
Hi everyone, my name is Alena Prcela, and today I'm presenting on a collaborative research project at Undergraduate, also with our own Patty Lowe. And the title of the project is Traditional Ecological Knowledge in the Apostle Islands. So I want to first start by identifying and thanking all the groups who were involved, because this really was a very multi-layered, multifaceted project with lots of different moving parts going on. So first I want to thank the Bad River, Lac du Flambeau, and Red Cliff bands of the Lake Superior Ojibwe, who helped carry out a huge portion of this research. Secondly, I want to thank Tribal Youth Media. Tribal Youth Media is a program started by Patty Lowe, as well as a member of the White Earth Tribe in Minnesota. Sorry. And so Tribal Youth Media, since it's been going on every summer, goes into the Lake Superior Ojibwe region and teaches multimedia and journalism skills to tribal youth there. So that's kind of where my role came in. I was a Tribal Youth Media assistant. Lastly, I want to thank the National Park Service, who provided funding for the project and also had some collaborative roles in that as well. So to set the stage, where we were working and living last summer is the Apostle Islands. If you're not familiar, the Apostle Islands are a group of 22 islands off the coast of northern Wisconsin. You can see a map there in the left-hand corner. The largest island, Madeline Island, is kind of towards the bottom of the photo. And Madeline Island is really the cultural center and heart of the Lake Superior Ojibwe region. So when the Lake Superior Ojibwe moved west, Madeline Island was where many people were living, gathering wild rice, performing sacred and cultural rituals and traditions, just performing day-to-day activities for hundreds of years. And then eventually, the Red Cliff, Bad River, and Lac du Flambeau tribes all moved to the mainland, Wisconsin, although the Bad River does have a portion of its reservation still on Madeline Island. But nowadays, it's actually pretty much all of the other islands are known as the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore and are managed and operated by the National Park Service. So kind of the impetus for this project was that the National Park Service wanted to learn more about the Ojibwe history associated with the land that they're now managing. And they also, because there are lots of visitors to the islands for a whole bunch of different activities, there's these beautiful caves that people come from all over the world to go kayaking in. So there's hundreds of people coming every summer to the Apostle Islands. So they wanted to better inform visitors as well of the deep and rich history of the islands. And this was mutually beneficial because it also awarded the opportunity for the Lake Superior Ojibwe bands that we were working with to collect their own traditional ecological knowledge archive, specifically related to the Apostle Islands and Alena. So I mentioned traditional ecological knowledge a couple times now, also known as TEK more easily. So broadly, TEK is indigenous culture, knowledge, beliefs, and practices, usually related to human and nature interactions and generally passed down orally. So the fact of the matter that TEK is usually passed down orally was another part of the reason we wanted to create an archive, so that we can ensure that stories are being preserved both orally but also in a digital online platform that can live on for many generations to come. So to give more of a concrete example of what TEK is, I want to share my favorite story that we gathered over the summer. We interviewed Mick Isham. Well, I shouldn't say we. All of the interviews were conducted by tribal youth after we taught them how to use the video equipment and perform interviewing techniques. So Mick Isham is a member of the Lakota Rae tribe and is also an executive administrator for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. And he told this wonderful story about how it was the first day that it was 48 degrees and he went out to go spearfishing because Western science teaches that the first day it's 48 degrees is when all the male walleye will swim to the shallow water to spawn. So you can catch a lot of fish. So he was out there, but he was really surprised because he wasn't catching any walleye. And that's when another tribal member said, Mick, what are you doing out here? And he was like, I'm going spearfishing, it's 48 degrees. And the tribal member says, well, you're not going to catch anything because the frogs aren't chirping. And Mick said, what do you mean? And he's like, the frogs aren't chirping, you're not going to catch anything. He's like, but it's 48 degrees. And it's this whole thing. And Mick doesn't really put it all together until the next summer, or not summer, it's 48 degrees, until the next season when he's out there and he's catching so many walleye and then he hears the frogs chirping in the background. And it is 48 degrees, so he puts it together that this is the prime conditions under which to catch walleye. So this is a really great example of TEK, and it also shows how TEK can live in conjunction with Western science. So we wanted to collect more stories like this, so we undertook the project. There's a photo of me with one of the tribal youth media participants, Amaya. So the way that the project was structured was that we first engaged in pretty rigorous multimedia training led by the tribal youth media staff. We taught participants pretty much everything from the technical to the aesthetic aspects of shooting good video, as well as interviewing techniques. So firstly, how do you ask meaningful questions that are open-ended and are going to yield really great answers? How do you ask follow-ups if your sources are kind of difficult and don't want to open up? And once we felt that all the tribal youth media participants felt comfortable with that and had shot, some footage around the reservation and were ready to interview people, we went out into the field and did just that. So we had a lot of really great site visits. We actually took several participants to Madeline Island, which is relatively far from the reservation. You have to drive about an hour and then take a ferry. And that was a really great experience. Many of the tribal youth who live on the reservation had actually never been to Madeline Island before. So this was a really great opportunity to not only bring the tribal youth there, but also collect some really meaningful footage while we were there. Two of my other favorite events that we were collecting footage at were the annual gathering of Ojibwe rice chiefs, where Ojibwe rice chiefs from all over the area come to Bad River and other annual events. And then we also collect a lot of footage at the annual Lake Superior Days, which is again a fairly big annual event. So in addition to those large annual events, we also collected everyday footage from around the reservation, at the Elder Center, and on the Ojibwe rice fields. So at the end of the summer, we had a bunch of videos, and that's kind of where my role stepped in. I was editing the videos, transcribing them for accessibility purposes for the digital archive we're going to create, as well as coding them according to cultural keywords that were decided on by participants from all three tribes prior to filming. So now that we had all these edited and transcribed and coded videos, we needed somewhere to put them, and that was in Muka2. Muka2 is a content content management system using open source platform that was developed with and by Indigenous folks, specifically the Wurundjeri tribe in Australia, and that was in 2007. And today it's primarily operated out of Washington State University, so really closer to home, and they have a really great department to help with any sort of questions that you may have in using or implementing the system. So if anyone decides to use Mukutu, they have a really great resource department that I would highly recommend. So basically, before I moved to the Bad River area for the summer, I spent a lot of time learning the platform, developing presentations to teach tribal participants from all three tribes how to use the platform most effectively, so that it wasn't just me inputting all the things online, but people from every tribe could have an active role in uploading the material that they wanted shared. And yeah, so the cool defining feature of Mukutu is what is known as digital heritage entries. This is kind of the back end of Mukutu where you can upload a digital heritage entry. So for example, someone could take a photo of a traditional basket, and then there's also a space within the site for a cultural narrative. So for example, the person who made the basket or another member of the tribe can write about the practices that enabled the basket to be made, the process, what the basket would be used for, that kind of thing, and have that accessible online. However, in our case, we weren't really working with photos, we were working exclusively in video, and I think this was a really great choice because instead of focusing on textual cultural narratives and descriptions, it really allowed tribal members to speak for themselves and tell their own stories in their own words, as well as having the textual transcriptions makes it accessible to folks who may not be able to watch or hear video. So that's kind of how it functioned with the digital heritage entries. I also want to go a little bit further into what makes Mukutu really unique and a really great platform for working with Indigenous culture and heritage. And that's the 3 C's, which you can see here, which is communities, cultural protocols, and categories. So the first is communities, which are groups of users or contributors. So we were clearly working with 3 different tribes, Red Cliff, Lac du Flambeau, and Bad River. But they're all housed under one site, the Lake Superior Ojibwe site. So basically each of the tribes will have their own homepage housed under one site. And I think this is a really useful tool because if there is a video that a tribal youth shoots that's relevant to all 3 tribes, it can appear in all 3 homepages. However, if it's something that, for example, only relates to Red Cliff, then it would be excluded from the other 2 tribes' homepages. So it's a really good way to share knowledge, but also keep some things private and sacred. Secondly, my personal favorite part of Mukutu are the cultural protocols, and these determine which users can access which content. And it basically functions to firewall specific entries from specific people. So for example, you can have a protocol that's just for enrolled tribal members, just for enrolled tribal members who are also elders, or for public. And those are just a couple examples. You can really customize this whichever way best meets the needs of the community. So I really like this because it allows for certain things, again, to remain sacred and private to the tribe, but it also allows certain things that the tribal historic preservation officers deem appropriate to be shared with the wider public, which I think is a really useful tool, especially for people who may be coming in with not a lot of knowledge, to learn more about the history and the cultural practices of the Ojibwe. Another really cool part about this is that if something is protocoled by 2 separate protocols, for example, women only and elders only and spring only, well, that would be 3. That would make it so that only female elders from a specific tribe can access that in the spring, because there are certain digital heritage entries that contain knowledge which can only be accessed during specific seasons. So I really like that, and I also really love the fact that nothing defaults to public. So that really is a good way to give tribal historic preservation officers and tribal members themselves agency over who's seeing what information. And then the third C is categories. So prior to filming and shooting, we met with all of the tribes who are involved in the project and decided on how to categorize all these videos we're going to be shooting that would be consistent across the site. And it was decided that the best way to do so would be to group by season. So within the seasons, you can also search by keywords. So for example, if you wanted to do research on everything related to fire, you could search within that season or across all 4 seasons. So it's a really good way for anyone who just wants some general knowledge can browse however they want, or if you're going in with a specific community need or a specific research need, then you can search in that way too. So lastly, I wanted to conclude by talking a little bit about why this project is important and the lasting implications. First and foremost is youth engagement. This was a really important way to get tribal youth thinking about practical ways that they can use multimedia journalism skills, both in their professional and personal lives and in their communities. And I think this was also really great at engaging elders in the communities to share stories that maybe they aren't telling every day, and kind of fostering that connection between tribal youth and elders and culture keepers, I think, is really important and was a good first step that hopefully will continue on. Secondly, cultural archiving and preservation. So many stories are passed down orally, but again, maybe they're not being told every day. So putting them in a digital archive that is created specifically for and with Indigenous communities is a really safe way to ensure that these stories are staying relevant and staying in the community's minds while also being in a safe place. And I think that's really important in developing a rich archive for years to come. And then lastly, this isn't up there, but I think that this was a really important project because it focused on teaching. I wasn't actually doing a lot of the research. My role was teaching tribal youth, teaching how to use this platform, and I think that that's one of the most important things you can do in research, is giving people in the community the tools so that they can continue with this project long after I leave for the summer. So I wanted to conclude by thanking everyone, especially Patty, who let me do this research with her that I really enjoyed, and who does so much for all these communities. I also wanted to thank CNAIR for inviting me to speak and being really supportive throughout this entire project, as well as thank all of you for coming out and listening to me speak today. Thank you.
Can we have a vote? Should we snare or CNAIR? How many for snare? Okay, CNAIR it is. Okay. Also, I just want to point out again, Lois just was honored learning that her paper is going to be published. Ava just learned that she is going to Yale to do her PhD. And Alena, just this week, has been nationally published in Progressive magazine for a story she wrote on the Indian Child Welfare Act. And so please go to the Progressive site and read Alena's story. It's really quite good. And once again, it just would like do you have a few minutes for some questions? Yes.
Oh, just a comment or two. I want to call your attention and the audience to the work of the Association of American University Women, which works a lot with STEM and sets up STEM programs. I live in Glen Ellen, and we have programs set up out there for junior high school students and onward. Also, there are fellowships for people working in STEM that are offered by the association. And we've had several doctoral students come through. So when you get to that stage, you might look that way too, for some financial support.
All right, thank you. Do we have any questions for our panel? I have a question about all of your talks really focused on indigenizing your process. For you, Lois, it was thinking about how to decolonize interpretations of what Alcatraz meant. Ava, you were trying to indigenize an experience and penetrate a space that is dominated by white males. And you, Alena, have been trying to help create this digital archive and think about how we indigenize Western science with these stories. So my question to each of you is, how did you have to change, or did you need to change your thinking? How did you decolonize your approach to your projects? Lois, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. That's a really great and really important question, and something I'm still continuing to think about moving into the future with this project. I know a lot of the things that I was drawing on, the ideas in Prcela, really intrigued me and spoke to me. And after reflecting on why they spoke to me so much, I found that the things that I found compelling were the way that this idea of the aesthetic break linked art and politics and found connections and relations. And I mentioned this in the talk, but that really spoke to me in my own worldview, which is grounded in relationality and grounded in everything being connected. And I wanted to take this idea, that it's an idea that's part of this leftist French canon that is very colonial in a lot of ways. So I wanted to take these ideas and put them in conversation with and add on to them, to add this indigenous lens through engaging with the work of people like Tuck and Yang, and then next year, as I write my thesis, bringing the ideas of people like Leanne Simpson into conversation with this. And I guess bringing it all back, whatever theorist I'm drawing on, whatever event I'm working with, bringing it all back to these indigenous worldviews and making that the way through which I approach theory and close readings and my archival research. I think that that's something that I strive to do that really informed my project here. And yeah.
Eva, how did you work to indigenize your approach to creating the STEM weekend?
Yeah, I'm pretty fortunate in that astronomy as a field, or astrophysics as it really is today, tends to rely very heavily on observational methods that people had throughout time. And there's a lot of recognition of indigenous knowledge within astronomy that I don't think you find so much in a lot of other STEM fields, or that you do increasingly but didn't historically. And so I think I was pretty fortunate to not only be brought up into, as Eddie likes to say, culture of cultural humility, but also to be in a field that really does like to account for what came before, and is always referring back to the earliest methods of observational astronomy that just involved looking up at the sky. Certainly I think that was very important. One of the things that was surprising to me in dealing with this was just how much buy-in I had from the department. I really thought it would be much harder to get a lot of, hardline scientists to buy into hearing about cultural knowledge. And it turns out that wasn't actually very difficult. I think that broadly there's a lot of appreciation for it, and I think that in many respects it both informs and complements a lot of the astronomy. I know that there was actually an effort through the Adler Planetarium to compile, in their case, Pawnee stories and compare Pawnee stars and objects in the sky to the ones that we named through Western science. And they found unerringly that the Pawnee knowledge was as valid, if not more so, because it was much ahead of its time, than the Western. And so largely I think that my field is fortunately conducive to an indigenized perspective.
And Alena, halfway through the summer, people were asking whose daughter you were because they thought you were a Bad River tribal member. Whatever you were doing, obviously, you had indigenized it, and I just wondered, how did you approach your experience?
Yeah, at its heart, this was a journalism project. I met Patty through the Middle School of Journalism, and there was lots of focus on journalism, although sometimes it didn't feel like that. It felt a lot more like community engagement sort of work. But I think within traditional journalism, there can oftentimes be reliance on certain narratives surrounding Native and Indigenous people that aren't conducive to growth or effective storytelling. And just the fact of the matter is journalism often doesn't allow a lot of opportunity for people to tell their own stories because they're telling it to the journalist, and the journalist is putting it out into a space through their own lens, kind of. So it was very different for me going into this experience. It was really hands-off on my part. I wasn't there for many of the interviews because there was some sacred knowledge that as a non-Native person I didn't have access to. I wasn't asking the interview questions. I wasn't editing. I was editing them, but not to change the meaning, more for clarity and things like that. So it was definitely different at first and not something I was used to, but in the end I found it I found it more rewarding to just let the stories speak for themselves and to believe that we had trained the tribal youth well enough that they'd be able to collect these interviews and there would be stories that were useful and very important